The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, creating waves of heat that danced across the vast expanse of Thomas McKenna's ranch. It was September 1887, and the drought had stretched on for 3 months, turning what was once fertile grazing land into a barren wasteland. Thomas wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse, Ranger, along the dried creek bed that had once provided water for his cattle. At 42 years old, Thomas had spent the better part of 2 decades building his ranch from nothing. His calloused hands told the story of countless hours mending fences, herding cattle, and fighting against the unforgiving elements of the American Southwest. His brown hair, now streaked with premature gray, stuck to his forehead beneath his worn leather hat. Deep lines around his blue eyes spoke of years spent squinting against the desert sun, but also of the loneliness that had settled into his bones like dust after a windstorm. The McKenna Ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of rough terrain, dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of mesquite trees. Thomas had inherited the land from his father, who had staked his claim during the territorial days when Apache raids were still a constant threat. Now, with the Apache mostly confined to reservations, the land felt both safer and somehow emptier. The silence was broken only by the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead and the steady clip-clop of rangers' hooves on the hard-packed earth. Thomas had ridden this particular stretch of his property countless times, but today something felt different. A sense of unease settled over him as he approached the rocky outcropping known locally as Devil's Crown. The formation jutted up from the desert floor like the spine of some prehistoric beast, its red sandstone walls carved smooth by centuries of wind and rain. It was here, in the shadow of these ancient rocks, that Thomas first noticed the buzzards. 3 of the large birds circled lazily in the cloudless sky, their black wings catching the thermals that rose from the superheated ground. Thomas's jaw tightened as he urged Ranger toward the outcropping. In his experience, buzzards meant only one thing: death. Whether it was one of his cattle that had wandered off and succumbed to the heat or something else entirely, he needed to investigate. As he drew closer to the base of Devil's Crown, Thomas caught sight of what had attracted the scavengers. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a bundle of rags caught among the rocks. But as Ranger picked his way carefully down the steep slope, Thomas realized with a jolt that he was looking at a human form. His heart began to pound as he dismounted and approached the still figure. The body belonged to a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old. Her long black hair was matted with dried blood, and her dark skin bore the telltale marks of violence. She lay crumpled against a boulder, her small frame barely visible beneath a torn and blood-stained dress that had once been white but was now stained brown with dirt and gore. Thomas knelt beside her, his practiced eye taking in the extent of her injuries. A deep gash ran along her left temple, disappearing into her hairline. Her arms and legs bore numerous cuts and bruises, and her breathing was so shallow that Thomas had to lean close to detect any sign of life at all. But she was alive, barely clinging to existence in the shadow of the unforgiving rocks. Thomas had seen violence before. The frontier was no place for the weak, and he had witnessed his share of Indian raids, cattle rustling, and the casual brutality that seemed to follow civilization westward. But something about this child's condition stirred a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. Without hesitation, he gathered her carefully in his arms, noting how light she was, how her small body seemed to weigh no more than a newborn calf. The girl's eyelids fluttered as he lifted her, and for a brief moment, Thomas caught a glimpse of dark brown eyes filled with pain and terror. She made a soft sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh, before losing consciousness again. Thomas felt a surge of determination as he carried her to his horse. Getting the unconscious girl onto Ranger proved to be a challenge. The horse, sensing something unusual, danced nervously as Thomas attempted to mount while holding his unexpected burden. Eventually, he managed to settle into the saddle with the child cradled in his arms, her head resting against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and irregular, and knew that time was not on their side. The ride back to the ranch house seemed to take an eternity. Thomas kept the pace steady but gentle, mindful of the girl's injuries. Every few minutes, he would glance down at her pale face, checking for signs that she was still breathing. Her skin felt hot to the touch, and he knew that fever was setting in. Whatever had happened to her, she needed medical attention immediately. The McKenna ranch house sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, a modest two-story structure built from local stone and weathered timber. Thomas had expanded it over the years, adding a wraparound porch and extra rooms that now stood empty, testament to dreams of a family that had never materialized. His wife, Sarah, had died of consumption 5 years earlier, taking with her their unborn child and leaving Thomas to face the vast loneliness of the frontier alone. As he approached the house, Thomas saw his ranch hand, Miguel Ramirez, emerge from the barn. Miguel was a stout man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. He had worked for the McKenna family for nearly 20 years, and his loyalty was absolute. When he saw Thomas riding in with a small figure in his arms, his expression immediately shifted to one of concern. "Dios mío, what happened?" Miguel called out as he hurried to help Thomas dismount. His English was heavily accented but clear, honed by years of working alongside American ranchers. "Found her at Devil's Crown," Thomas replied grimly as Miguel reached up to take the girl. "Looks like she's been beaten pretty badly. We need to get her inside and send for Doc Morrison." Miguel nodded and carefully lifted the child from Thomas's arms. Up close, the extent of her injuries was even more apparent. Her dress was torn in several places, revealing more cuts and bruises on her arms and shoulders. Her feet were bare and bloody, suggesting she had been running across rough terrain. "She's just a child," Miguel murmured, his voice filled with compassion. "Who would do such a thing?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He had his suspicions, but they would have to wait. Right now, the priority was keeping the girl alive. He led the way into the house, up the stairs, to one of the unused bedrooms. The room was sparsely furnished but clean, with a simple bed, washstand, and wooden chair. Sunlight streamed through the single window, casting long shadows across the pine floor. Miguel gently placed the girl on the bed, while Thomas hurried to gather supplies. He returned with a basin of water, clean towels, and the basic medical kit he kept for treating injured animals. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until the doctor arrived. "Ride to town and fetch Doc Morrison," Thomas instructed Miguel as he began carefully cleaning the blood from the girl's face. "Tell him it's urgent. And Miguel, don't mention this to anyone else just yet. Not until we know more about what happened." Miguel understood the implication immediately. In this part of Arizona, tensions between white settlers and the Apache still ran high, despite the official end of the Apache Wars. A badly beaten Indian girl would raise questions, and not all of them would be friendly. He nodded and headed for the door. "I'll be back before sunset with the doctor," he promised. Alone with the unconscious girl, Thomas continued his careful ministrations. As he cleaned away the dried blood and dirt, he was able to get a better look at her features. She had the high cheekbones and straight nose, typical of the Apache people, with skin the color of burnished copper. Her hair, once freed from the matted blood, was long and straight, black as a moonless night. Despite her injuries, there was something striking about her face. Even in unconsciousness, there was a strength there, a quiet dignity that spoke of inner resilience. Thomas found himself wondering about her story. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, who had done this to her? As he worked, the girl stirred occasionally, sometimes muttering words in what Thomas assumed was Apache. He couldn't understand the language, but the tone was clear enough. Pain, fear, and something that sounded like calling for someone who wasn't there. During one of these episodes, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes flying open in panic. For a moment, their gazes met. Her dark eyes were wide with terror, darting around the unfamiliar room as if expecting attack from any direction. Thomas spoke softly, his voice as gentle as he could make it. Easy there, little one. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you. The girl stared at him for several long seconds, her grip on his wrist gradually loosening. She seemed to be trying to assess whether he was friend or foe. Finally, exhaustion overtook her again, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Thomas continued his work, cleaning and bandaging her wounds as best he could. The gash on her temple was the most serious, requiring several stitches that he hoped would hold until the doctor arrived. Her feet were cut and swollen, suggesting she had run a considerable distance over rough terrain. Whatever had happened to her, she had fought to survive. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself keeping a vigil beside the bed. He had pulled the wooden chair close and sat watching the rise and fall of the girl's chest, alert for any change in her condition. The house was eerily quiet, filled only with the occasional creak of settling timber and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. It was during one of these quiet moments that Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the girl's left shoulder, partially hidden by her torn dress, was a distinctive scar. It was shaped like a crescent moon and appeared to be several years old. Thomas had seen a similar mark before, during his time as a young man working for the territorial government. It was the kind of scar left by a specific type of branding iron, one that had been used by a particular group of men who operated on the fringes of civilized society. Slavers. The thought hit Thomas like a physical blow. Despite the official abolition of slavery throughout the United States, the practice continued in various forms along the frontier. Indian children were particularly vulnerable, often captured and sold to work on remote ranches or in mining operations where questions were rarely asked. The implications of this discovery weighed heavily on Thomas's mind. If the girl was an escaped slave, then someone would likely come looking for her. And if they found her at his ranch, both he and the child would be in serious danger. The men who engaged in such practices were not known for their mercy toward those who interfered with their business. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas heard the sound of approaching horses. He moved to the window and was relieved to see Miguel returning with Doc Morrison. The doctor was a thin, elderly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He had been practicing medicine on the frontier for over 30 years, and there wasn't much he hadn't seen. Thomas met them at the front door, his expression grim. "She's upstairs, Doc. Been unconscious most of the day." Doc Morrison nodded and followed Thomas up to the bedroom, his worn leather medical bag in hand. He took one look at the girl and immediately went to work, his experienced hands checking her pulse and examining her injuries with professional efficiency. "Whoever did this meant to kill her," the doctor said grimly after completing his examination. "She's lucky to be alive. The head wound could have been fatal if it was just a little deeper. And these other injuries," he shook his head sadly, "this child has been through hell." "Will she live?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Doc Morrison was quiet for a long moment, washing his hands in the basin. "Hard to say. She's young and seems strong, but she's lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours will be critical. If she can make it through tonight without taking a turn for the worse, I'd say her chances improve considerably." The doctor left detailed instructions for the girl's care. Keep her warm, try to get her to drink water if she regained consciousness, and watch for signs of infection in her wounds. He also left a bottle of laudanum for the pain, warning Thomas to use it sparingly. "One more thing," Doc Morrison said as he prepared to leave. "This girl is Apache, isn't she?" Thomas nodded reluctantly. The doctor's expression grew serious. "Thomas, I don't know what happened to her, and I'm not going to ask. But you need to understand that helping her could bring you trouble. There are folks in town who wouldn't take kindly to you harboring an Indian, especially if she's connected to any recent incidents." "There haven't been any Apache raids in this area for months," Thomas replied. "No, but that doesn't mean people won't make assumptions. Just be careful, and if her condition changes, send for me immediately." After the doctor left, Thomas found himself alone with the girl once again. Miguel had offered to stay and help, but Thomas had sent him home to his own family. This was something he needed to handle himself, at least for now. As night fell over the ranch, Thomas settled into the bedside chair with a cup of coffee and his father's old rifle across his knees. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the scar on the girl's shoulder had put him on edge. If slavers had been operating in the area, they would likely be looking for their missing property. The girl remained unconscious through most of the night, though she occasionally stirred and mumbled in Apache. During one of these episodes, Thomas caught what sounded like a name, Ayana. He wondered if this was her name, or perhaps the name of someone she was calling for. It was nearly dawn when the girl finally opened her eyes and stayed awake. Thomas had dozed fitfully in the chair, but her movement immediately brought him to full alertness. She looked around the room with careful, intelligent eyes, taking in every detail before her gaze settled on Thomas. "Water," she whispered, the single English word barely audible. Thomas quickly poured water from the pitcher into a glass and helped her sit up enough to drink. She was weak, but managed to take several small sips before lying back down. Her dark eyes never left his face, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl was silent for a long moment, as if debating whether to answer. Finally she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear. "They called me many names," she said, in accented but clear English. "None of them were mine." The simple statement carried a weight of suffering that made Thomas's chest tight. He found himself struggling for the right words. "What would you like me to call you?" Again, that long pause. When she spoke, there was something defiant in her voice, despite her weakened condition. "I don't remember my real name. It's been too long." Thomas felt a surge of anger at whoever had done this to her, at a system that could steal not just a child's freedom, but her very identity. He made a decision that surprised even himself. "Then we'll give you a new name, a name that belongs only to you." The girl's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, he caught a glimpse of something other than pain and fear. It might have been hope. "What name?" she asked. Thomas thought for a moment, remembering his wife Sarah and the daughter they had planned to have. They had chosen a name together, spending long winter evenings discussing possibilities. Sarah had favored classical names, drawn from the literature she loved. "Grace," he said finally. "Grace McKenna." The girl, Grace, considered this for a long moment. Slowly, she nodded. "Grace," she repeated, as if testing how the name felt. "I like it." It was a small victory, but Thomas felt something shift in that moment. This child had been cast aside, left to die in the desert, but she had survived. And now she had a name that no one could take away from her. As the morning sun began to filter through the bedroom window, Thomas knew that his life had changed irrevocably. He had made a choice to help this girl, and there would be consequences. But looking at Grace's face, seeing the first spark of hope in her dark eyes, he knew he had made the right decision. The real test, however, was yet to come. Somewhere out there, men were likely searching for her. And when they came, Thomas would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to protect the child he had given a new name and perhaps a new life. But that was a challenge for another day. For now, Grace was alive. She was safe, and she had a name that belonged to her alone. It was a beginning, and sometimes, Thomas reflected, a beginning was all you needed to change everything. The desert wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and carrying with it the promise of change. Neither Thomas nor Grace knew what the future would bring, but they would face it together, and in the vast loneliness of the Arizona frontier, that meant everything. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. 3 days had passed since Thomas McKenna had brought Grace into his home, and the girl's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Despite Doc Morrison's cautious prognosis, Grace had proven to be as resilient as the desert cacti that dotted the landscape. Her fever had broken on the second night, and by the third morning she was sitting up in bed, her dark eyes alert and watchful as she observed her surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had learned never to let her guard down completely. Thomas found himself checking on her every few hours, bringing meals that she ate with surprising appetite despite her small frame. She spoke little, answering his questions with brief responses, but he could sense her intelligence in the way she absorbed everything around her. Grace watched how he moved through the house, noted the locations of doors and windows, and seemed to be cataloging every detail of her environment. On the fourth morning, Thomas entered the bedroom to find the bed empty. His heart jumped into his throat as he quickly scanned the room, fearing the worst. Had someone taken her during the night? Had she run away? But then he heard the soft sound of movement from the kitchen below. He descended the stairs quietly and found Grace standing at the window, looking out over the ranch. She had managed to find one of Sarah's old dresses in the wardrobe, a simple blue cotton garment that was too large for her slight frame, but clean and whole. Her long black hair had been braided neatly down her back, and despite the healing cuts and bruises that still marked her face, she looked more like a child and less like a victim. "You shouldn't be up," Thomas said gently, not wanting to startle her. Grace turned to face him, and he was struck again by the depth of intelligence in her dark eyes. "I feel stronger, and I needed to see." "See what?" "How far I can see in all directions. How many places there are to hide if they come." The simple statement sent a chill down Thomas's spine. She was still just a child, barely 13 years old, but she spoke with the wariness of someone much older, someone who had learned that safety was always temporary. "Who do you think might come?" he asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to the window. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The men who owned me. They don't like to lose their property." The word property hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had suspected as much from the scar on her shoulder, but hearing it spoken aloud by the child herself made it real in a way that filled him with cold rage. "Tell me about them," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "It's better if you don't know. Then you can honestly say you know nothing when they ask." "Grace, I need to know what we're dealing with. If these men are dangerous, I need to be prepared to protect you." She turned to look at him then, and Thomas saw something in her expression that broke his heart. It was the look of someone who had learned not to hope, not to trust in protection or promises of safety. "You cannot protect me from them," she said simply. "They have too many men, too many guns. The best thing you can do is pretend you never found me." Thomas stood up and walked to where she stood by the window. Gently, he placed his hands on her shoulders, feeling how small and fragile she was beneath the oversized dress. "Grace McKenna, look at me." He waited until her dark eyes met his. "I found you left for dead in the desert. I brought you into my home, and I gave you a name. That makes you family, and I don't abandon family. Do you understand?" For the first time since he had found her, Grace's composure cracked slightly. Her lower lip trembled, and her eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Family," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Family," Thomas confirmed. "Now I need you to tell me everything you can about these men. Not because I'm going to turn you over to them, but because I need to know how to keep you safe." Grace was quiet for several minutes, and Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. Finally, she began to speak, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "Their leader is called Harrison, Jake Harrison. He has a ranch about 2 days' ride north of here, near the Mexican border. They take children from the reservations, from raids on isolated homesteads. Sometimes they buy them from other traders who work the border towns." Thomas's jaw tightened. He had heard rumors of such operations, but had never seen proof. The territorial government was still too weak in many areas to effectively police such activities, especially in the remote regions where Harrison apparently operated. "How long were you with them?" he asked. 3 years, since I was 10. Grace's voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the cost of these memories in the tension around her eyes. "I was taken from my grandmother's camp during a raid. They killed the adults and took the children who were old enough to work but young enough to be controlled. The implications of that statement made Thomas feel sick. What kind of work? Whatever they needed. Cooking, cleaning, tending animals. The older girls... Grace's voice trailed off and she shook her head. It doesn't matter now. But it did matter, Thomas realized. Every bit of information mattered because it would help him understand what they were up against. However, he could see that pushing Grace for more details right now would only cause her more pain. "How did you escape?" he asked instead. This question brought the first hint of something that might have been pride to Grace's face. There was a new girl, maybe 8 years old, Maria. She was sick, and Harrison said she was no use to him if she couldn't work. He was going to... Grace paused, her hands clenching into fists. "I couldn't let him hurt her, so I caused trouble, made noise, fought back." Thomas could imagine the scene, and he felt a surge of admiration for this brave girl who had risked her own life to protect someone smaller and weaker. "Did you save her?" Grace's expression fell. "I don't know. They beat me and threw me in the back of a wagon. I think they were taking me somewhere to be sold or disposed of, but the wagon hit a rock and I fell out. They didn't notice right away because it was night and they were drinking. By the time they realized, I had crawled into the rocks where the horses couldn't follow. And you walked from there to Devil's Crown?" "Ran, mostly, for 2 days. I could hear them searching, but I know how to hide. My grandmother taught me before." Grace's voice broke slightly on the last words. Thomas felt a deep ache in his chest for this child who had lost everything and yet had still found the courage to risk her own life for another. He made a silent vow that Harrison and his men would never get their hands on her again. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Both Thomas and Grace tensed, but when Thomas looked out the window, he saw Miguel riding up to the house with another man Thomas didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and lean, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. Most notably, he wore a silver star pinned to his leather vest. "It's Miguel with the lawman," Thomas told Grace quietly. "Go upstairs and stay out of sight until I know what this is about." Grace nodded and moved quickly toward the stairs, but Thomas caught her arm gently. "Grace, no matter what happens, remember that you're Grace McKenna now. That's who you are." She nodded and disappeared up the stairs, just as Miguel and the stranger reached the front door. Thomas opened it before they could knock, his expression carefully neutral. "Morning, Miguel. What brings you by so early?" "Thomas, this is Sheriff Carson from Tucson. He's been asking questions in town about missing children." Sheriff Carson was a man in his 50s with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in every detail. His handshake was firm, and his voice carried the authority of long experience in law enforcement. "Mr. McKenna, I'm investigating reports of illegal activities in this region, specifically the trafficking of children, primarily Indian children. I was wondering if you might have seen or heard anything unusual in recent days." Thomas felt his heart begin to race, but he kept his expression steady. "What kind of unusual?" "Well, we have reports that a group of children escaped from a criminal operation north of here. Most were recaptured, but at least one may still be at large. A girl, Apache, about 12 or 13 years old. The description was too accurate to be coincidental. Someone had talked, or worse, someone had seen Grace and reported her presence." Thomas made a quick decision. "Sheriff, why don't you come in? Miguel, you too. Coffee's still hot." As they settled around the kitchen table, Thomas tried to read Carson's intentions. The man seemed genuinely concerned about the welfare of the missing children, which was encouraging. But Thomas had learned to be cautious about trusting anyone, especially lawmen who might have their own agendas. "This criminal operation you mentioned," Thomas said carefully, "how long has it been going on?" "Longer than we'd like to admit," Carson replied grimly. "The territorial government has been aware of rumors for years, but these people are smart. They operate in remote areas, move frequently, and they have enough money to buy silence when they need it. But something's changed." Carson nodded. "We finally got a break. One of their victims escaped about a week ago and made it to a mission near the Mexican border. A boy, maybe 15 years old. He was in bad shape, but he was able to give us information about their operation. Thomas felt a spark of hope. If law enforcement was finally taking action against Harrison's organization, it might mean that Grace would be safe sooner than expected. What kind of information? Names, locations, methods of operation. This Jake Harrison character runs a tight operation, but he made the mistake of keeping too many children in one place for too long. The boy who escaped was able to give us detailed descriptions of the ranch layout, guard routines, everything we need to plan a raid. Miguel leaned forward in his chair. When will this raid happen? Soon, within the week if we can coordinate with the federal marshals, but in the meantime, we're trying to account for all the missing children. The boy mentioned that several escaped during the confusion when he made his break. Most were caught, but he thought at least one girl might have gotten away. Thomas made another quick decision. The sheriff seemed legitimate, and if he was planning to shut down Harrison's operation, Grace might be safer with official protection than hiding at the ranch. Sheriff, before I say anything else, I need to know something. If this girl you're looking for is found, what happens to her? Carson's expression softened slightly. Officially, we try to return children to their families when possible, but in cases where that's not feasible, we work with the territorial government to find suitable placements, foster families, sometimes adoption, if the circumstances are right. And what if someone had already taken her in, given her a home? The sheriff studied Thomas carefully. Mr. McKenna, are you telling me you found this girl? Thomas took a deep breath. Sheriff, 3 days ago I found a badly beaten Apache girl near Devil's Crown. She was more dead than alive. I brought her here, got her medical attention, and she's been recovering ever since. Carson's eyes widened. Is she here now? She is. But before I bring her down, I need your word that she won't be taken away from here unless it's to a situation that's genuinely better for her. A deal. The sheriff considered this for a moment. Mr. McKenna, I appreciate what you've done for this child, but I have a responsibility to ensure her welfare and safety. I can't make promises about placement until I've had a chance to assess the situation fully. It wasn't the guarantee Thomas had hoped for, but he could hear the sincerity in Carson's voice. More importantly, he could hear the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Grace had apparently been listening and had decided to take matters into her own hand. She appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing Sarah's blue dress, her long braid hanging over one shoulder. Despite the healing bruises on her face, she carried herself with quiet dignity as she looked directly at Sheriff Carson. I am Grace McKenna, she said clearly, and I choose to stay here. The sheriff stood up slowly, his experienced eyes taking in her condition and demeanor. Hello, Grace. My name is Sheriff Carson. I'm very glad to see that you're safe and being well cared for. Grace moved to stand beside Thomas's chair, her small hand coming to rest on his shoulder. The gesture was simple, but spoke volumes about where her loyalties lay. Mr. McKenna saved my life, she said. He gave me a name and a home. I will not leave unless he tells me to. Thomas reached up and covered her hand with his own. I'm not telling you to leave, Grace. Sheriff Carson sat back down, his expression thoughtful. Grace, I need to ask you some questions about where you came from and what happened to you. Some of it might be difficult to talk about, but it's important that we have the information so we can stop these men from hurting other children. Grace nodded solemnly. I will tell you what I can. For the next hour, Grace recounted her story to the sheriff. She spoke with remarkable composure about her capture, her years of captivity, and her escape. Carson asked careful questions, taking notes in a small leather journal. Thomas was struck by Grace's courage in reliving these painful memories, and also by her intelligence in providing exactly the kind of detailed information that would be useful in planning the raid on Harrison's operation. When she finished, Sheriff Carson closed his journal and looked at both Thomas and Grace with something approaching amazement. Grace, You've given us more useful intelligence in 1 hour than we've been able to gather in months of investigation. This information will help us save other children who are still being held." Grace nodded but said nothing. Thomas could see the emotional cost of the conversation in the slight tremor in her hands and the way she held herself rigidly upright. "Sheriff," Thomas said, "what happens now? Now we move forward with the raid. With Grace's information, we should be able to coordinate a successful operation within the next few days." Carson turned to Grace. "You should know that your testimony will be crucial in bringing these men to justice. There will likely be a trial, and you may be called to testify." Grace's grip on Thomas's shoulder tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I will do whatever is necessary to stop them from hurting more children." Sheriff Carson stood up and moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to Thomas. "Mr. McKenna, about Grace's living situation. Normally, the territory would require formal paperwork for this kind of arrangement. But given the circumstances and the fact that she clearly feels safe here, I'm willing to work with you on making this official." Thomas felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "What would that involve?" "Adoption papers, most likely. It would give you legal guardianship and give Grace the protection of your name and citizenship status. I can help you get the process started when I get back to Tucson." After the sheriff left, promising to send word when the raid was scheduled, Thomas and Grace found themselves alone in the kitchen. The weight of the morning's revelations hung heavy between them. "Are you sorry you told him?" Thomas asked. Grace shook her head. "No, those men need to be stopped, and Sheriff Carson seems like a good man." "He is, and he's right about the adoption papers. It would make you legally my daughter, which would give you protection under the law." Grace looked at him with those serious dark eyes. "Is that what you want, to be my father?" The question was asked so simply, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of abandonment and loss. Thomas thought about his answer carefully. "Grace, I never had children of my own. My wife died before we could have the family we dreamed of. But from the moment I found you in that desert, I knew that God had given me a second chance. Yes, I want to be your father, but more importantly, I want you to feel like this is truly your home." Grace was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas could see her struggling with emotions she wasn't quite sure how to express. "I don't remember my real father," she said finally. "He died when I was very small, but I think he would be glad to know that you found me." It was the most personal thing Grace had shared since her rescue, and Thomas felt honored by her trust. Then it settled. "You're Grace McKenna, and this is your home." But even as they spoke of the future, both Thomas and Grace were aware that danger still lurked in the shadows. Harrison and his men were still out there, and until Sheriff Carson's raid was successful, Grace would remain at risk. Moreover, there was no guarantee that all of Harrison's associates would be captured in a single operation. As if reading his thoughts, Grace moved to the window again, her eyes scanning the horizon. "They're still looking for me," she said quietly. "I can feel it." Thomas joined her at the window, following her gaze across the vast expanse of desert. "Let them look. They won't find you here." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas felt a chill of premonition. The desert was vast, but it was also unforgiving to those who didn't know its secrets, and men like Harrison had survived this long by being thorough in their hunting. That night, as Grace slept peacefully in her bed upstairs, Thomas sat on the front porch with his rifle across his knees. Miguel had offered to stay and help keep watch, but Thomas had declined. This was his responsibility now, his family to protect. The desert night was alive with sounds, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. But Thomas's ears were tuned for different sounds, the approach of horses, the clink of metal, the low voices of men who moved through the darkness with violent intent. As he sat in the darkness, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. A week ago, he had been a lonely widower going through the motions of running his ranch. Now he was a father, protector, and potential target of dangerous criminals. The transformation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Inside the house, Grace stirred in her sleep, calling out softly in Apache. Thomas had grown accustomed to her nightmares, which came with decreasing frequency but still haunted her sleep. He had learned to listen for the change in her breathing that indicated she was waking from a bad dream, and he would quietly check on her, offering comfort when needed. Tonight, however, her sleep seemed more peaceful. Perhaps talking to Sheriff Carson had helped, giving her hope that justice might finally come for the men who had stolen her childhood. Or perhaps it was simply the growing sense of safety that came from having a place to belong. As the hours passed, Thomas found his thoughts turning to Sarah. What would his wife have thought of Grace? He believed she would have loved the girl's courage and strength, would have delighted in teaching her to read and helping her learn the social graces that would serve her well in the world beyond the ranch. Sarah had always wanted to be a mother, and Thomas liked to think that somehow she would approve of the daughter he had found in the desert. The sound of a horse approaching at speed broke through his reverie. Thomas tensed, bringing the rifle to ready position, but then relaxed as he recognized Miguel's distinctive riding style. His ranch hand was pushing his horse hard, riding as if pursued or bearing urgent news. Miguel reined in his lathered mount at the porch steps, his face grim in the moonlight. "Thomas, we have trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "I was in town earlier, having a drink at the saloon. There were strangers there, 3 men asking questions about missing property. They had descriptions, Thomas. Detailed descriptions." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. "Did they mention this ranch?" "Not specifically, but they were asking about isolated homesteads, places where someone might hide a runaway." "And Thomas?" Miguel paused, clearly reluctant to deliver the next piece of information. "One of them had a crescent moon brand on his saddle horn." The significance of that detail was not lost on Thomas. The same brand that had been burned into Grace's shoulder was now riding through the territory, searching for her. "How many men?" "3 that I saw, but there could be more. They were well armed and had the look of men accustomed to violence." Thomas stood up, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Miguel, I need you to do something for me. Ride to the Hendricks Ranch and ask Jim to send one of his boys to Tucson with a message for Sheriff Carson. Tell him Harrison's men are in the area and closing in." Miguel nodded. "What about you and the girl?" Thomas looked up at the window of Grace's room, where a soft light indicated she had awakened and was likely listening to their conversation. "We're going to disappear for a while. Where will you go?" "Better you don't know. That way you can honestly say you haven't seen us." Miguel understood immediately. In situations like this, ignorance was often the best protection. "How long should I wait before I start looking for you?" "Give us a week. If we're not back by then, assume the worst and get word to Sheriff Carson." As Miguel rode off into the night, Thomas hurried into the house to find Grace already dressed and packing a small bundle of belongings. "I heard," she said simply. "They're close. Too close. We need to leave tonight." Grace nodded, her movements efficient and purposeful. She had lived this kind of life before, always ready to run, always prepared for the worst. But Thomas could see the difference in her demeanor now. She was still afraid, but she was no longer alone. "Where will we go?" she asked. Thomas had been thinking about this possibility for days. "There's a place my father used to use when he needed to disappear during the Apache Wars. It's a hidden canyon about 20 miles north of here. Water, shelter, and only one way in or out. And if they find us there," Thomas checked his rifle and began gathering ammunition, "then we make our stand." As they prepared to leave the ranch house, Thomas felt a pang of regret. This had been his home for 20 years, the place where he had built his life with Sarah, where he had planned to grow old. Now he was abandoning it to protect a child who had been in his life for less than a week. But as he looked at Grace, saw the trust in her eyes and the determination in her small frame, Thomas knew he was making the right choice. Home wasn't a place, he realized. Home was the people you were willing to fight for, the ones you couldn't imagine living without. They slipped out the back of the house and made their way to the barn, where Thomas quickly saddled Ranger and a smaller mare named Star. Grace moved with silent efficiency, her feet making no sound on the packed dirt floor. She had clearly learned the value of stealth during her years of captivity. As they led the horses out into the desert night, Thomas took one last look at the ranch house that had been his sanctuary. It sat dark and quiet under the star-filled sky, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he remembered. "We'll be back," Grace said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't entirely certain she was right. The men hunting her were determined and dangerous, and they had resources that Thomas couldn't match. But he had something they didn't, a cause worth fighting for and a daughter worth protecting. They rode north into the darkness, leaving behind the only home Grace had known since her rescue. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the possibility of freedom and a future where she could truly be Grace McKenna without fear. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and unforgiving, but also protective for those who knew its secrets. And as they disappeared into its embrace, Thomas silently vowed that Harrison and his men would have to kill him before they laid another hand on his daughter. The hunt was on, but Thomas McKenna was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a father, and there was nothing more dangerous in the world than a man protecting his child.